Welcome to Timberline Bass Podcast, your place for Wisconsin bass fishing and everything outdoors.
Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the Timberline Bass Podcast. Tonight we are going to do an episode getting down and freaky with bed and bass. Kind of go into some detail a little bit, just on ways to hunt them down, tips and tricks for getting them to bite, just some general knowledge. Going to try to relate specifically to Wisconsin here. It's a little different here than it is down south. Um, so yeah, we'll dig right into it. Um, so starting out is the differences in the times between when smallmouth and largemouth generally spawn. Commonly, smallmouth spawn first, or at least in my experience. Um, and it's kind of neat the way it works in Wisconsin. It sort of starts in the southern part of the state and flows its way up north. Um, there's lakes down south that they might even be spawning already. Um, there's a few around here where they're spawning opening weekend, and then we'll have fish up north in that Minocqua area and farther north than that are spawning around, you know, Memorial Day weekend. Um, I think a lot of it comes down to water temperature. Um, but there's a lot of debate that moon phases and time of day and stuff like that plays into it. It's just like rutting stuff with deer. I mean, there are so many variables. It's hard to tie it all down to a specific thing. If the conditions aren't correct, they'll just kind of stay in that pre-spawn stage a little longer, putting on that feed bag. Um, you know, I guess like the big thing is understanding the mechanics. So, uh, your buck bass will build the bed, and then more or less they just try to entice females to come. Um, my understanding is multiple females will visit the beds. They come, they do their little dance, rub on each other. The female lays the eggs, and then the male fertilizes them and stays on the bed and waits for him to hatch. And then he will stick around to protect all the fry and stuff too. Um, that's another thing, kind of. I don't know if you consider it post spawn or part of spawn, but a lot of times when the males stick around with the fry, they can be really easy to catch too. Not they're harder to pin down than when they're on beds, but they're still in that defensive guardianship mode where they're watching over them little ones. Um, but so I mean, I guess the biggest regional differences um, from different sections of Wisconsin is just the fact that it's kind of funny the way it rolls from south to north on the spawn. I mean, I'm sure if a guy really looked at it and kept track, like it's almost a rolling calendar. You can plan it out based on that. I mean, I know lakes I could go next weekend and catch bedding fish already, and I know where I can go pretty much right up until Father's Day and catch bedding fish. So it's just kind of one of them neat things. Um, so now you figure out they're spawning. You pick your lake. Your buddy tells you they're on beds. The next step is finding beds. So there's some pretty key differences between smallmouth and largemouth on where they like to make their beds. Granted, not every lake's gonna have gravel and stuff in it, and I've seen smallmouth make beds in sand and stuff like that, and up against logs and trees and dock posts and cinder blocks and buckets and whatever crap's in the water. And largemouth do all that too. But typically, smallmouth prefer clear water, which I mean is a given. Pretty much everybody knows that. Um, and they prefer to spawn on like rock and gravel and stuff like that. Where largemouth, I mean, I don't know that I've ever seen. Well, no, I can't. So largemouth more seek out the logs, the stumps, the root balls. They really like the root balls of lily pads and stuff like that. I mean, that's a really big one to look for. On a lake if you know where the lily pads normally come up. Go hunt around by the root balls and stuff. Typically, there's beds there. Um, and they like that darker bottom kind of. It's so hard because I've seen largemouth kind of spawn even on the same stuff as smallmouth. Um, but typically that's the rule of thumb, the stuff to look for. Um, Most guys know this. The easiest way to identify beds, you're pretty much just looking for circles or weird clear spots. And on certain lakes, like sandy lakes and stuff like that, they can be really hard to spot. Um, it's really nice when they clean off the sand where they're going to bed, and you can see the little circles of rock. It does get really tricky though, hunting around root balls and stuff like that at times. Um, I've even seen them where they kind of halfway tuck up underneath logs and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, so generally you just go around and look for the circles. The next step is identifying whether or not there's a fish on the bed or not. And even if you can't necessarily see the fish, you know, there's been plenty of times the male will be hanging off to the side, just over by some grass or laying next to the stump or something like that. So it doesn't hurt to make a pitch at it and see if something reacts to it, even if you don't see one on the bed. Um, but we also have a lot of darker lakes in Wisconsin where it's not necessarily as simple as just going around and looking for the spots, um, which brings in the new confangled electronics. Um, you can, especially for deeper beds and stuff like that, it's very possible to go out and hunt for beds using 360 and forward facing in perspective mode or whatever. um, a combination of the two makes it a little easier. You can kind of find it on the 360, and you can even leave your live transducer and forward and kind of watch the fish on there. And if you watch your screen and plan out how many feet away it is and kind of keep an eye on that, bouncing back between both screens. You can make sure you're getting your bait on the bed, see the fish on there, watch for them when they swim off with it. Same thing with perspective mode, working onto the bed. It's harder to see your bait on there. I'm not going to say it's impossible. I've heard guys have got it dialed in good enough that they can. But the big thing when you're doing it on perspective mode, you're kind of pulling it on the bed and just waiting to see the fish go swimming off. If you don't feel them bite it or pick it up or whatever. Um, but I would say too, at times doing it with electronics where you're farther away, darker water, the fish don't spook quite as easily. I mean, not that they don't know you're there, but as time goes on, this might change. But right now, though, the fish that are harder to see typically don't feel quite as harassed. They're not as gun shy on picking up the bait to move it. And that's the one big key thing people need to understand with bed fishing for bass. They're not trying to eat that bait. They put on the feed bag. They already well aware they're going to go a while without eating any food. When they pick that bait up off the bed, all they are trying to do is remove it. They don't want to swallow it. They pick it up with their mouth, they carry it off to the side, and they spit it. And that's why you have such a short window when they pick it up to set the hook on them. And aside from the electronics thing, when you're actually sight fishing for beds, and everybody knows this, um, polarized sunglasses to cut the glare off the water makes a huge difference. You can do it without it, um, depending on angle of the sun, ripples on the water, whatnot. It can make it a little harder. Um, I know a lot of guys out there have probably seen the videos, the Elite Series and stuff like that on betting tournaments, carrying around the jugs and they're spraying Dawn dish soap on the water. Kind of puts that oily film on there. I don't know if it makes it a little easier to see, or my understanding is it cuts down on the ripples. Um, they use Dawn dish soap for cleaning up oil spills and stuff. I mean, I'm sure it's not the most ideal thing in the world to be spraying in the water, but I don't know that it really hurts anything. Um, so now we found the beds. We're gonna target them. We're gonna try to catch the fish off there. Now, depending when you hit it, whether they've got a female there or not. Um, there's a pretty significant difference between the male and the female behavior. Typically, ideally, you want the females. Females, through both, all the bass species, I don't care if they're, largemouth, smallmouth, spots. Your females typically are bigger. Not saying you can't get a 4 pound male or anything like that, but typically your bigger ones are the females. Um, Now, the difference in their behavior, the female is there for one thing. She's got one thing on her mind. She wants to lay her eggs and she wants to move on because the females don't lay all their eggs in one go either. That female might lay eggs 3 times throughout the spawning window in the different stages as they pull up and stuff like that. So she's going to lay some eggs. They're going to do their little dance, whatever. She's going to go back off and eat for a little bit. And then she'll find another bed and do the same thing. That's how they diversify genetics. But typically, females are harder to get to bite. Where the males, on the other hand, while you can struggle with them, they are in full on Mary Poppins dad mode. Their whole existence at that point in time is to protect those eggs and to protect, the fry and whatnot. Um, so normally you can convince him to bite pretty easy. Now there are some tricks. Let's say you roll up on a bed and there's a male and a female on there. My personal experience, if they're doing the whole rubbing on each other thing, you can have a hard time getting them to bite. Sometimes at that point you're better off marking that bed, on your graph. Go hunt down a few more, come back a little later, see if they're done. Sometimes the females stick around for a little bit afterwards. Um, Not real long. Um, but yeah. So move on, come back. Keep that in the back of your head. If the female is hanging around, a lot of times when you throw on there, the male will go for it first. But if you've ever kind of half-ass stuck one or pinned one and you yank them off the bed, and if you pay attention, a lot of times the female will kind of dart towards the middle of the bed or pay a lot more attention to it. Well, the trick is to catch that male, box him, and then that female is going to kind of take on a little bit of that protector role. And not all the time, but sometimes you can throw back in there once that male's gone and you can get her to bite. Um, like I said, not a guarantee, but something to keep in the back of your head and try. You got to be careful doing that. If you have your limit, don't be boxing a fish and getting caught. I mean, technically in a tournament, you got 6 fish in the box. That's breaking the rules. So I mean, discretion advised. Um, but if you're working on your bag for the day, there's nothing wrong with doing that. Um, Another thing too is how long do you spend on a bed? There's plenty of them you can roll on and one cast them. It don't matter what you're throwing at them. You get it in the middle, they hit it. You set the hook, you're good. You got them. There's other times where you got to sit there and finesse them a little bit. Maybe they've been harassed. Maybe he's hook shy. How often do you go bed fishing and you pull one up and they've got 3, 4 hook marks in their lip? I mean, especially smallmouth. Smallmouth will defend that bed to the frickin' death. I mean, hands down, during the spawn, one of the greatest frickin' fathers in the animal kingdom. Unfortunately, they're also cannibals, and later on they'll eat fry. But during that time period, they will defend their little ones until the death. So, um, but then when they're being finicky like that, maybe you make 10, 15 casts to it. Now, if you're fun fishing, I catch myself doing this. I'll sit there for hours. If it's a good one, I mean, it means something to me to be able to say, hey, I went down a whole stretch of bank and caught every fish off the bed. It's fun fishing. I ain't in a hurry. I ain't trying to prove anything to anybody other than myself. I'll sit there for an hour. It don't bother me so much. And then every once in a while you get one that pisses you off so bad you just say to hell with it and move on. Now, in a tournament situation, you definitely have to monitor your time a little bit better. Maybe you spend 5, 10 minutes. I mean, it's all whatever you're comfortable with. And the other thing too is, do you got a bag already? Are you sitting pretty good and you're working on a kicker? Yeah, it might not hurt to spend 20 minutes, a half hour trying to pluck that one off the bed. Now, if you are just starting out and your first fish on the first bed is giving you a hard time, maybe move on and come back. Scale them up by eye. Are they really going to help you? That's another thing to look at. Um, you know, the other thing is too, if they are a good one and you do need it, even if it is a kicker, if they're not biting, I mean, yeah, you could maybe sit there for an hour and get them to bite, or you could sit there for 3 hours and they never touch it. But a lot of times, if you go away, let them chill out for a little bit, relax, come back 20 minutes, half hour later, a lot of times their whole attitude changes, and that fish goes from being the epitome of your existence to a one hit wonder. You toss it in there, they smack it, there you go. The other thing you guys got to keep in the back of your head is, other people in the tournament hunting beds too. Like, is somebody going to sneak up behind you and get that fish? Do you stay in eye shot? All stuff to consider. Um, Another thing too, you can tell a lot how the fish is reacting to the bait. When there's a lot of times you pick it up and maybe the wind rippled the water and you lost it and all of a sudden they're swimming off, or you see your line go and you set the hook and you miss. Well, then they're actually picking it up and taking it off. But a lot of times too, you'll get them where they'll just come up and bump it with their nose. Don't know if they're trying to push it, if they're just trying to tap it to get it to go away. But there is a lot of times that they do. They just bump it. Um, and I've had on occasions where they bump it, you feel it, you set the hook, and you end up pinning them in the side. If you're fun fishing, you throw them back, it doesn't matter. You caught them either way, whatever, move on to the next one. Almost every tournament I know, and it might even be a state law, I'm not 100% on it, I should have looked it up. Um, Foul hooked fish, when you're sight fishing, do not count. If you set the hook on that thing and you caught it in the side of the head or the belly or whatever, it is your responsibility and the morally correct thing to do to throw that fish back. And I'm not speaking from any hypocrisy or anything. I mean, in a tournament, if I foul hook a fish, it goes back in the water, and I will sit there and catch it again if it's one I need, the correct way in the mouth. Um, so that's where the paying attention to their behavior really matters. Because there's sometimes where they'll bump it, and they'll bump it a few times and they get sick of it. It's not going anywhere, or they bump it and you pick it up and shake it a little bit, and they'll suck it up real quick and go to run off with it. So just another thing to keep in the back of your head: foul hooked fish is a no in a tournament. Fun fishing, whatever, you're throwing them back anyways. Um, Now we can kind of get into baits a little bit. Um, Growing up, our big thing was throwing tubes, tubes, or maybe a craw Texas rigged or a jig or something like that. Nowadays, I find myself a lot more throwing a Ned rig. Um, and you can kind of break them into categories too. I see it as a reaction category and kind of a finesse category. Um, when they're hitting it right off the bat, you're pulling it on, they come over, suck it up to get rid of it. That's a reaction bite. That's when fishing a tube or something like that, where you can crack them quick, get them out of their boat, flip them. Big stick, heavy line, awesome. Those are fun days. Um, it doesn't always work out that way though. Um, Going back to the BFS stuff, I like to, I like throwing a Ned rig on there. So a lot of times I'll do the little Ned craws or the weird little tickler things or a little beaver bait or something like that. Um, Sometimes they want to create, or don't want a creature bait on their bed. Sometimes you can have a lot of luck getting them to, throwing a lizard or a brush hog or something like that on there, where they completely ignored a tube. They've seen 100 tubes and they're over it and whatever. They're just going to leave it alone. Um, and then another good one is you know a drop shot. A shorter leader going down, but doing like a minnow or something on there, or even Ned rigging a minnow. Um, Works fairly good. It kind of looks like they're nosing down and rooting around in the bed, which is exactly what they don't want, especially if there's eggs on there. Um, and then along with baits, the colors. There's if you're if you're actively sight fishing, you can see the bed. I like to throw because they don't care what the color is. Like they're not biting it because they're hungry or going to eat it. Like naturalness kind of goes out the window in my opinion. Now, if you're really struggling on one, maybe would it hurt to throw in something a little more natural looking? Maybe it would help. I don't know. But sight fishing, I like doing white baits because they stand out really good on the bed, and a lot of times when the white disappears, you set the hook and you got them. Or like a chartreuse or a bright orange, and it doesn't hurt to have a couple other ones. Maybe they've seen a million white baits, and that's why they're attributing that to, and ignoring you. Maybe throw a fluorescent orange or bubblegum color or something like that. Switch it up. Another good bait too is a shaky head. Throwing a white zoom trick worm or a chartreuse trick worm or bubblegum. Um, Sometimes they want they'll attack it if it's sitting on the bottom. Sometimes they'll ignore it and won't hit it unless it's floating up a little bit. That's where maybe run a little paddle tail over it. I know a lot of times like river smallmouth, when you can't see them, one of the tricks to figuring out where the beds are when they're too shallow to see with electronics, um, throw a top water over top. They just wander away from the beds. So they'll come up and try to smack it away, and technically you didn't see them. I mean, it's dark water. You don't know where the beds are. You're using it as a search bait. In my opinion, that is, if they ram into it and hook themselves in the side, you weren't sight fishing. That wasn't a foul hook. Now, check your tournament rules. Like, don't take my word on that. There might just be a blanket thing during spawn. no foul hooked fish. I don't know. Um, every tournament organization might treat that a little different. I'm not sure. I've never ran into that issue, um, but if they miss it and they're smacking it around, that's where to throw back in with a jig or a Ned rig or something along those lines. Um, where was I with this? But yeah, so colors, bright colors. Now when you're fishing with electronics, color really doesn't matter so much. You're more fishing by what you're seeing on the electronics themselves, and fishing by feel to an extent too. Um, so you can get away with throwing more natural colors, or even keep throwing the bright ones. It really doesn't make a difference. Another thing to look at too, like I've been saying, the differences between tournament and fun fishing. Um, totally changes what you're going into it to accomplish. Things that can, conditions that can change your day on the water. One big one is wind. Um, you get that ripple on the water, it can be a lot harder to see if you're fishing shallow beds, sight fishing. But there are times where the wind can help. You can't see the fish can't see you as good either. There's a lot of times where the wind will settle them down a little bit, make things a little easier. And the other thing that can kind of bite you in the ass is, cloud cover. Is it super bright outside? Is it cloudy? It can make it a little bit tougher to see the beds with or without glasses. Um, so yeah, all things that can change your day pretty quick. Um, Now there's a lot of arguments out there. You know, the morality of bed fishing. Um, I think if you're bed fishing to take them home and slab them out and eat them, I kind of see a problem with that. But I'm so torn on it because we have regulations in place, and well, you can't always trust that the regulations are necessarily exactly what needs to be happening. You got to put some faith in it. If a guy's staying within his limits, I mean, I would prefer not to see people keeping them, during the spawn. That just seems a little crooked to me, but to each their own. I'm not judging. Um, I think especially fun fishing, you're catching them, you're throwing them back. They got a sore lip. It's no different than catching them any other day. They get right back down there. They can protect them eggs. Most of your lakes, I think, even for a tournament, keeping five of them, taking them to weigh in and bringing them back out. A lot of these lakes have so many fish. Are you really damaging the population? I don't know. I mean, I know there's been studies out there. Guys say both ways. I'd say a lot of that comes down to your personal beliefs. I know there's a lot of people that will not bed fish, and there's nothing wrong with that. I actually have a lot of respect for those people. Um, but I guess I'm kind of a dirtbag, and I think it's fun to have a couple of weeks out of the year where I can go pluck them off beds and put them back. It's not very often in Wisconsin we get tournaments that are bed fishing related. Sometimes you'll catch the end of the spawn. There are some that do happen during the spawn, but it's not like it's super common. We don't purposely schedule any to be bed fishing tournaments. Like I said, the morality is in your court. Do as you will with it. I mean, most people will not judge you on it. Um, Another big thing, though, is proper fish handling during the spawn. I mean, proper fish handling all the time. Make sure you're running your aerator. Try not to handle them too much. Get them in the water. If you are going to throw them back, if they're short or, you're calling out, get them back into the water decent. Don't just be whipping them off the side of the boat, stuff like that. And I mean, respect our resource. This is something we all love to do. And very rarely have I ever seen anybody not treat fish well. I know a lot of us, we carry G juice and stuff like that, carrying a thing of Mountain Dew around if you tongue hook one, get them to stop bleeding, Ice in the live well, there's a debate on whether that's good for them or not. I mean, most guys I know genuinely do everything they can to keep those fish alive. Um, so not here to stand on a pulpit and preach about that. Um, Sorry, I wrote down notes after the fiasco with me trying to wing it on the one episode. I decided this was the best course of actions, and I'm still a bumbling moron. Um, so now around spawning time, different strategies. Earlier in the spring, if you're on a lake and doing a tournament where it could potentially be a spawning tournament or a pre-spawn, all these things I can't help but to see the spawn itself as all three: pre-spawn, spawn, and post-spawn. And I know what we're talking about here is bed fishing, but like I said, they go in stages. So aside from the very beginning, um, most of the time you have all three stages going on. Somewhere out deep, there's fish feeding up to spawn. You've got the fish on the beds and trying to get on the beds. And then you've got fish that are done already and they're out in the middle, either not necessarily in the middle, but they're off guarding fry or putting on the feed bag trying to recuperate after the weeks of rutting around and, all that good stuff. Um, so in a tournament situation, you need to make a decision. Are you going to when you're pre-fishing, are you going to run around and mark beds and just plan a milk run? So when you take off in the morning, you've got all your waypoints set. Bang, 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 bang. We're going. We're hitting all these beds. A lot of us calculate the weight out. This is what I'm going to have. This is what I think it's going to take to win. And pray for the best. Pray, Billy Bob and ain't going to jump and take half your bed fish away. And then you got to look at do I go and hunt pre spawners? Do I do a combination of it? Am I going for post spawners? I mean, most of the time that's going to take you in completely separate parts of the water column, different parts of the lake. A lot of times when you do have fish on beds, the pre spawn and post spawn are just out deeper from there a lot of times, depending on what's around. Um, just eating. It's definitely a viable option, and your odds of getting a really nice kicker out there, getting some big female that's getting ready to spawn or being done spawning. I mean, that's definitely something you genuinely need to look at in that situation. Definitely feel out what's going on and make a decision from there. In all honesty, another thing in a tournament, you know, Billy Bob went and caught half your bed fish. You had three different bays all marked up with beds. You made it to one, you get to the second one and they're all plucked off, or you can tell they were harassed or whatever. Um there's nothing more frustrating and scary in a tournament when you got to pull an audible out of your rear end and make a new game plan. So kind of with a lot of the mapping and stuff we've got nowadays, look for areas that or past experience too. Where can I find what they were betting on here? Do you pull an audible and look for something totally different? Um, or maybe Billy Bob ain't got live scope and he got all the shallow ones. Do you go out a little deeper and try scoping some? Look for some on 360. All things to consider in a spawning time tournament. Um, and the other thing too, the remembering when it's time to move off a fish and come back, you got to keep all that stuff in the back of your head. Um, Now, some common mistakes people make when they're bed fishing. Uh, you know, a lot of guys get frustrated or overzealous, and they'll sit there and they pull that bait on the bed and they yank it right off, or overshoot it when they're trying to get on it. Um, or they get it on the bed and the fish is coming up to it, and then they're getting all happy and shaking the piss out of it. You can move the bait too much. There are times it really doesn't matter. There's times that's what's going to get them to bite. I mean, 90% of bed fishing is pissing the fish off and getting them to be like, you know what, I don't want you here. It's time to go. Bar's closed, boys. You ain't got to go home, but you can't stay here. I mean, that's what they're doing. Um, so yeah, I mean, be mindful of how they're reacting to it with what you're doing. Maybe you got to slow down a little bit. Maybe you got to speed up a little bit. Another real easy one to do, and I think we're all guilty of it, is not watching the fish closely enough. Rolls over and you lose it for a second. Well, normally that's about the time your line goes whizzing off, and you were sitting there staring at the hole like a moron, and here the fish is long gone, or spit it already, and they're back sitting there laughing at you because you weren't paying attention. Um, all you can really do on that one is do your best to keep an eye on them. I mean, all it takes is the wind, a breeze coming through and rippling the water or whatever. I mean, it happens. And then the key one that you see messed up more often than not is boat positioning. Depending on depth and stuff, and depending on the fish, sometimes you can get right on top of them. I mean, I've literally caught fish right next to my freaking trolling motor. But a lot of times that spooks the hell out of them. Sometimes you might be able to see the bed and you got to back way off of it and blind cast to it and feel for them. If you can't see them on the electronics or you can't see them, it is what it is. Sometimes you just got to do that. Um, so it's fun fishing. I'm a little less, if I get too close on one and I don't want to bite, I mark the bed and come back later and just stay off it a little bit. In a tournament, you're better off maybe trying to work your way up to it a little bit. If it's not super windy and you can get away without using your power poles and making a bunch of noise, keep your trolling motor down low. Do everything you can to not spook them to the point of, maybe turn the sonar off. Go in your settings on your unit and turn ping off. All those things, these fish, there's some proof there. They get shy to all the noise. Your trolling motor going, um, especially if you got an older one with a chip to hell blade, like they vibrate more, they make noise. It is what it is. The sonar pinging, power poles going up and down, dropping crap in the boat, especially in tin boats, like stomping around like a moron, listening to music, talking. Normally, when I go out bed fishing, I try to go by myself. It's nice and quiet. If something dumb happens, I got nobody to blame but myself, and I just go out and I do it. And then another one is, not really a mistake, but timing when to set your hook. Like I said, we want to try to avoid foul hooking them as much as possible. Um, sometimes you can see them when they pick it up, it'll be sticking out of the side of their mouth. Well, then you have your guarantee, like jack on them, you got them. It's all there's so many little nuances and little tricks to bed fishing. I think it was an episode of Bass After Dark. Travis Manson was on there, and he gave some pretty cool secrets and tricks they've got. A little out of the box for getting smallmouth to bite on beds, and I'm not going to ruin it. It's not my trick. It's not my tip. Go back and look for the spawning episode of Bass After Dark. It was somewhere at the end of the episode. Phenomenal. Something I would have never thought of. Um, a lot of times if I got a super finicky one and I can't get them to bite, I'll do like a core tackle wacky shot, or their little wacky rig with just a little bit of weight on it, and I'll throw a wacky rig Cinco on there and just flutter it onto the bed. Um, just all little weird stuff, and it's finding out what you're good at and having when I go bed fishing, I've got 4 or 5 rods on the deck. If this ain't work, if A doesn't work, go to B. If B doesn't work, go to C. If C, and etc. Like, you can get as in depth with it as you want. No matter what, it's always a good time. Um, so that's all I got on bed fishing. If anybody's got any questions or anything, feel free, shoot me a DM. comment on the Facebook page, whatever. Just shoot me a message and I will get back to you and try to answer any questions you got. Now we'll get to the final cast for today. So knowing when to move on from a bed, like that's a pretty important life lesson, and none of us are always perfect at it. But I think, with so many things in fishing, like learning patience and how to trust your gut and all that good stuff. I feel like knowing when to move on is a pretty important life lesson. Whether it's sitting on a bed for a smallmouth or a largemouth, or it's that dead end job, maybe a bad relationship. I mean, I've made some pretty big life changes recently, switching jobs and stuff, and it's knowing when to move on. Uh, Things aren't going the way you think they ought to be, or you got better opportunities. Don't sit there and waste your life shaking your worm for that bad opportunity or that fish that ain't gonna bite, because there's always a fish that's gonna bite somewhere. You just gotta find them. So, thanks again, everybody. Like, comment, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. And thanks again. I could not do this without the people that are watching it and supporting the channel. Thank you for watching the Timberline Bass Podcast. Please like, share, subscribe, tell your friends, comment, all that normal stuff. Thank you very much for your support.